At 78 years old, Eleanor Brandt sat alone in a cold spare room at the back of her son's house while Christmas music played on the other side of the wall. They had driven her there that afternoon, handed her a plate of food gone lukewarm in the car, and told her plainly to stay out of the way. Through the door, she could hear her grandchildren laughing, the clink of glasses, her son Daniel's voice carrying over all of it. No one came to check on her. The plate sat untouched on her knees. She did not turn on the light. This was the same woman who had raised Daniel alone after Walter died. They had already sold the home she lived in for 40 years. They had emptied her late husband's accounts down to the last dollar. They had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was a burden to be managed, and that the battered brown suitcase she carried everywhere was just junk an old woman refused to let go of, but they forgot to ask what was inside it. And the night Eleanor finally opened that suitcase, the family that left her alone on Christmas would learn exactly what their cruelty was going to cost them. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Brandt lived at 211 Sycamore Lane in the town of Millbrook, in a narrow blue house with a porch swing Walter had hung himself in 1979. She was 75 then, and every morning she rose at 5:40 without an alarm, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and the day's crossword from the Millbrook Herald. She finished it in ink only on Sundays. The neighbors set their clocks by the light in her kitchen window. Eleanor had been a bookkeeper for 31 years at Hartley & Sons, the lumber supply on Route 9, the same Hartley that was her own father's name before she married. She could still read a ledger faster than the young men at the bank could run their machines. She kept her own accounts in a green cloth notebook, every dollar entered in a small, even hand. When the church needed someone to untangle the building fund, they brought it to Eleanor, and she had it balanced to the penny by Friday. She loved Tuesdays best, because Tuesday was the day her granddaughter Lily came after school. They baked together cardamom bread from Walter's mother's recipe, and Eleanor taught her to fold the dough the slow way, by hand. Anything worth keeping, she told the girl, you make with your hands. Lily was 11, and she listened. In the front hall closet, beneath the winter coats, sat an old brown leather suitcase with brass clasps gone dull. The family had seen it 100 times. Daniel had once asked, half joking, why she didn't throw out that ugly old thing. Eleanor only said it was Walter's and closed the closet door. She never opened it. She did not need to. She simply liked knowing it was there. The first warning came on a Sunday in October. Daniel arrived without calling, his wife Marissa beside him, both in their good coats. They walked through the house slowly, the way buyers do. Marissa ran a finger along the banister and said the place was getting to be a lot for one person. Daniel asked, gently, whether Eleanor had thought about simplifying things. He used the word twice. He asked if she still kept the house deed in the desk in the den. Eleanor said she managed fine, thank you, and put the kettle on. When they left, Marissa hugged her a beat too long. That night, Eleanor noticed the desk drawer in the den was not quite shut. She had always shut it square. She pressed it closed and told herself she was an old woman who misremembered small things. She did not check what was inside. The second warning came when the Herald stopped arriving. She called the paper. They said the subscription had been canceled by a family member, paid through, no action needed. She called Daniel. He said he'd look into it and change the subject to her doctor's appointments. She let it go. He was busy. He had always been busy. What no one in Millbrook knew, what Eleanor herself had nearly forgotten, was that the woman doing crosswords in ink could read a contract better than most lawyers, and that somewhere under those winter coats was a thing Walter had left for one reason only, for the day she would need it. she was not worried that October. She made her cardamom bread, finished her Sunday crossword in ink, and slept with the window cracked the way she always had. She had no idea how little time was left. The papers came on a Thursday, the 14th of November. A young man in a gray jacket knocked at 9 a.m. and handed Eleanor a manila envelope, apologized without meeting her eyes, and walked quickly back to his car. Inside was a single sheet from the law office of Pruitt and Stone, dated 3 days earlier. It said the property at 211 Sycamore Lane had been transferred, that the new owner of record was a holding company called Brandt Family Investments, LLC, and that Eleanor Brandt was to vacate the premises no later than the 31st of December. At the bottom, beside a notary's stamp, was a signature. It read Eleanor M. Brandt. The handwriting sloped to the right. Eleanor's handwriting had sloped to the left her whole life. She sat down at the kitchen table with the page flat in front of her and read it 4 times. Then she got up, went to the den, and opened the desk drawer she had pressed shut in October. The house deed was gone. In its place was a photocopy, folded once. She called Daniel. He did not pick up the first time. On the second call he answered, and his voice had the smooth, rehearsed calm of a man who had practiced. "Mom, before you get upset," he started. She asked him whose signature was on the transfer. He said it was for her own good, that the house had needed work she couldn't afford, that he'd handled it so she wouldn't have to worry. She asked again whose signature it was. He said she was confused, that they'd talked about this in October, that she'd agreed. She had not agreed. She had put the kettle on. Eleanor did the thing she had always done with a problem. She went at it straight. She drove herself to Millbrook to see Howard Klein, who had handled Walter's will 20 years before. Klein was retired now, but he saw her in his sunroom. He read the transfer slowly, and when he set it down, his face had changed. He told her the signature was forged, that the LLC was controlled by Daniel and Marissa, and that the deed had been recorded with the county. He told her, kindly, that she had a case, but that it would cost money to fight, real money, and take a year or more, and that the house was already legally in their name until a court said otherwise. He asked, almost as an afterthought, what she had in savings. That was the second thing Eleanor learned that week. She went to First Millbrook Savings, where she and Walter had banked since 1968, and the teller turned the screen toward her. Walter's accounts, the ones she had never touched, the ones meant to bury her someday, had been drawn down to a balance of $41. Authorized signatory Daniel R. Brandt added the previous spring under a power of attorney she did not remember signing. She stood at the counter a long moment. Then she thanked the girl and walked out into the cold without buttoning her coat. She fought anyway. For 5 weeks she fought. She wrote letters. She filed a complaint with the county recorder. She called 3 lawyers in the city. 2 never called back, and the 3rd wanted a $4,000 retainer she did not have because her money was gone. She drove to Daniel's house twice. The first time Marissa met her on the porch and would not let her pass the door. The second time, no one answered, though the cars were in the drive and she could see the kitchen light. On the 23rd of December, 2 men came with a small truck. They were polite. They had a court order. They moved her things into boxes while she stood in the front hall, and when she reached for the suitcase under the coats, one of the men said everything had to be inventoried first, and Daniel, who was there now, said, "Just let her take the bag. It's worthless." waving his hand the way you wave at a fly, so they let her take the bag. Daniel drove her to his house himself. He talked the whole way about how this was temporary, how the spare room was comfortable, how she'd thank him eventually. She watched Millbrook go by out the window and did not answer. When they arrived, he carried her 2 boxes inside and set the suitcase down in the spare room without looking at it. That was Christmas Eve. The next night, Christmas night, she sat alone in that room with the door shut and the music coming through the wall. And for the first time in 20 years, Eleanor pulled the brown suitcase onto the bed and worked the brass clasps with her thumbs. The lid came up slow. On top lay a photograph of Walter on the porch swing, squinting into the sun, younger than she could stand to look at. Beneath it, folded in waxed paper, was a recipe card in his mother's hand, and tucked against the side, half slipped behind the satin lining, was a stiff envelope she had never seen. She opened it. Inside was a check uncashed, the paper gone soft at the folds made out not to Eleanor Brandt, but to Eleanor Hartley, in the amount of $4,200. Across the bottom, in small printed type, ran a line, account balance statement enclosed. See reverse. Eleanor turned it over. She read the number once. Then she read it again. Then she sat down on the floor beside the bed, the check in both hands, the Christmas music still playing on the other side of the wall, and for a long time she did not move at all. She did not sleep that night. She sat against the side of the bed until the music stopped and the house went dark, and then she did the only thing she had ever known how to do with numbers that did not make sense. She checked them by the lamp. With the green cloth notebook she still carried in her purse, Eleanor copied out everything in the envelope in her small, even hand. There was the soft, uncashed check for $4,200 made out to Eleanor Hartley. There was a statement from a transfer agent called Continental Registry, dated 19 months earlier, listing 142 shares held in the name Eleanor Hartley, account opened in 1971. And folded behind it all, in Walter's blunt pencil, was a note she read so many times she had it by morning. Nell, if you ever need it, this is yours alone. I put it in your maiden name so no one can ever take it but you. W. The number on the reverse of the statement, the one that had put her on the floor, was $3,104,000 and change. She did not believe it. That was the bookkeeper in her. A number that size did not exist because a tired old woman wanted it to. So before the house was awake, she packed the suitcase, called a cab she paid for with $11 and a handful of coins, and had it take her to the bus station. And she rode the early bus out of town with the suitcase on her lap and her coat buttoned all the way to the throat. She left no note. Let them wonder where she'd gone. They had not wondered before. She got off in Caldwell, the county seat, because Caldwell had a public library with computers and a reference desk, and Eleanor's first instinct had always been to find the records herself. She spent the morning learning to use the machine with the patience of a woman who had taught herself worse. She typed Cardinal Mutual, the company name on the oldest certificate in the booklet, and followed it forward through 40 years. Cardinal Mutual acquired by Granite Financial in 1988. Granite folded into Meridian Bancorp in 2001. Meridian bought by a national bank in 2014. Each merger converting the old shares into new ones at ratios she copied down and multiplied twice to be sure. By 2 in the afternoon, she had it balanced. The number was real. The shares had never been sold, never been claimed, never been touched, because they had never been in the name anyone went looking under. She closed the notebook. Her hands were steady. She bought a cheese sandwich from the machine and ate all of it, which she had not done in a week. But knowing a thing is yours and laying hands on it are two different problems, and Eleanor had no lawyer. no address, and $41 to her name. She could not walk into a bank as a woman who had been thrown out of her house and ask them to hand her $3 million. She needed somewhere to stand first. The reference librarian was a woman named Ruth Okafor, 61, who had watched the old lady work the same desk for 6 hours without once asking for help, and had noticed the suitcase never left her feet. Near closing, Ruth brought her a cup of tea she had not asked for and sat down across from her. She did not pry. She only said the library closed at 5 and asked, plainly, whether Eleanor had a place to go. Eleanor, who had not told a soul the truth in 5 weeks, found herself telling Ruth all of it, because Ruth had brought the tea without being asked, and that small thing undid something. Ruth's own mother had spent her last 2 years in a county facility after a son emptied her accounts. Ruth had never gotten the money back and had never stopped being angry about it. She gave Eleanor the spare room over her garage that night and would not take rent. She also gave her something Eleanor needed more than a bed, the name of a lawyer who would not ask for $4,000 first. The lawyer was Daniel Owusu, a young man 2 years out of law school with a storefront office between a nail salon and a check cashing place, who took cases other firms turned down because they did not pay enough. Eleanor laid the whole suitcase out on his desk, the booklet, the note, the statement, the forged transfer she had carried the whole time. Owusu read for an hour without speaking. Then he told her 3 things. First, the shares were almost certainly hers, free and clear, and worth what the statement said. Second, claiming them would take weeks of paperwork with the transfer agent, identity verification, a notarized affidavit, possibly a small probate filing for Walter's estate. But it was clean. No one could contest it because no one else's name had ever been on it. And third, the house and the bank accounts were a separate fight, a harder fight, but the forged signature changed everything if she was willing to go to the police. Eleanor said she would think about the house. She told him to start with the shares. For 3 weeks she worked. She rode the bus to Caldwell every morning. She sat with Owusu and filled out forms, and when the transfer agent demanded proof she was Eleanor Hartley, she produced her 1962 marriage license, her father's name on the lumberyard letterhead, a baptismal record the church mailed from Millbrook. She had kept everything, because a bookkeeper keeps everything. She opened a new account at a Caldwell bank in her own full name. Word drifted back to Millbrook the way it does in small counties, that old Mrs. Brandt had run off, that she was staying in some stranger's garage, that she'd finally lost her grip. At the Millbrook diner, a cousin laughed and said the old woman had probably gone senile carrying that ratty suitcase everywhere. Eleanor heard about it from Ruth and only said, "Let them," and went back to her forms. The adversary escalates. Daniel found out his mother had a lawyer before he found out why. What he knew was that she had vanished, that she had hired someone, and that an inquiry had come to Pruitt and Stone asking about the transfer of 211 Sycamore Lane. He did the thing a cornered man does. He moved faster. He and Marissa had already listed the next prize, the lake house at 14 Birch Hollow Road, Walter's family place, the one piece of property the family still controlled on paper, and now they rushed it to closing. A developer named Coastal Ridge Partners wanted the lakefront lot and offered $480,000. Owusu, doing the slow, careful work of tracing every property Walter Brandt had ever owned, because he wanted the whole picture before he advised Eleanor about the house, pulled the records on the lake house to confirm who held it. What he found stopped him. The lake house at 14 Birch Hollow Road had never belonged to Daniel and had never belonged to Walter outright either. In 1986, Walter had placed it in a living trust, the Hartley Family Trust, and named a single trustee with sole authority to sell or transfer it. The trustee was Eleanor Hartley. The same maiden name, the same quiet, deliberate hand of a man who had spent his life making sure his wife could never be left with nothing. Daniel's sale to Coastal Ridge was not a sale at all. He had signed away property he did not own. Using Owusu, checked the closing documents, twice a transfer signed Eleanor M. Brandt, the same forged left sloping as Wright's signature from the Sycamore Lane papers. He had forged her name a second time. Owusu called Eleanor into his office and laid it out. The lake house was hers, entirely, and always had been. The sale was void. Coastal Ridge had wired $480,000 to Daniel for a house he could not legally sell, and the moment their lawyers discovered it, and they would come for that money, and they would find a forged signature underneath it, which was no longer a family dispute, but a felony. The buyer would sue. The county would have to act. And the only living person who could sign the documents to either unwind the mess or let it stand, the only person whose name the entire collapse now rested on, was the grandmother Daniel had driven to a spare room and told to stay out. The obstacle cleared. The certified letter freezing the sale reached Daniel and Marissa on the 31st of January. By then, Eleanor had already done the thing that mattered. With Owusu beside her, she had filed the trust documents with the county, recorded her name as trustee of record, and frozen 14 Birch Hollow Road so that nothing could move on it without her. She had claimed the 142 shares. Continental Registry transferred the full balance into the account in her own name on the 2nd of February, and a bookkeeper who had lived for a month on $41 sat in a Caldwell bank and watched $3,104,000 settle under the words Eleanor Hartley. She did not celebrate. She wrote the figure in the green notebook, entered the date, and underlined it once. Then she asked Ruth to drive her. The lake house at 14 Birch Hollow Road had not been lived in for years. Ruth parked in the frozen drive, and the two women walked up to a porch with a sagging board and a front door swollen shut against its frame. Eleanor put her shoulder to it the way Walter used to, and it gave. Inside there was dust over everything and a smell of cold and mice. But the bones were good pine floors Walter had laid himself, a stone fireplace, a long kitchen with windows facing the water. Eleanor walked through every room with her notebook open, writing as she went. Not what was broken, what it could be. She had decided what to do with the money on the bus out of Daniel's house, though it had taken her until now to say it aloud. She would not buy a smaller house and disappear into it. She had spent 5 weeks learning exactly what it felt like to be an old woman with nowhere to go on a holiday, told to stay out of the way, and she had decided no one who came to her would ever feel that again. She was going to turn the lake house into a place, a real place, with her name on it, where any grandmother left behind on Christmas could come and find a warm room and a full table and nobody waving a hand and calling her worthless. She moved fast because she was 78 and did not intend to waste a season of it. She hired a contractor named Pete Vasquez and a crew of 4 and paid them properly and on time, which got around Caldwell faster than any sign could have. She had the swollen door rehung, the porch board replaced, the roof patched before the February thaw. She bought a long farmhouse table that seated 20 and had it set up in the kitchen before the walls were even painted, because she wanted to see the chairs filled in her mind while she worked. She kept the books herself, every dollar in the green notebook. And Vasquez said later he'd never had a client who could catch a math error in his invoice from across the room. The town, which 6 weeks earlier had been laughing about the senile old woman and her ratty suitcase, began to come around slowly, the way towns do. Ruth told the truth to anyone who asked, and the truth traveled. The librarian whose mother had died in a county facility. The contractor who got paid double time for the holiday weekend. The girl at the Caldwell Bank who had watched the old woman's hand stay steady over a number that would have shaken anyone. One by one, they stopped saying lost her grip and started saying, have you heard what she's doing out at the lake? The church in Millbrook, the same one whose building fund she had once balanced to the penny, sent 2 women out with a casserole and an apology nobody had asked them to bring. She had the brass plaque made in March. She drove to the engraver in Caldwell herself and wrote out the words on a page from the green notebook so there would be no mistake. The Brandt Family Respite Home, founded by Eleanor Brandt for every grandmother who was left on a holiday. She kept the Brandt name in it on purpose. It had been Daniel's weapon, Brandt Family Investments, the holding company that took her house, and she meant to take the name back and make it mean the opposite of what he'd made it mean. The money that had hidden in a maiden name for 50 years came fully into the daylight now, and it did exactly what Walter had built it to do. It paid the crew. It bought the beds, 12 of them, real ones, with good mattresses. It paid Owusu to keep the legal work clean and to set the house up properly as a charitable trust so it would outlast her. Eleanor signed those papers in her own true name, sloping left, and the bookkeeper in her took quiet satisfaction in how clean the ledger was, every dollar accounted for, nothing forged, nothing hidden. Everything where it belonged, but it was not over, and Eleanor knew it was not over. Daniel still had $480,000 of Coastal Ridge's money in an account, and a developer's lawyers circling, and a forged signature underneath all of it that only one person could speak to. He had drained Walter's accounts and never been called to answer for it. He still believed somewhere that he could talk his way out, that his mother was confused, that the old leverage would hold one more time. Through February and into March, Owusu fielded calls first from Daniel's lawyer, then from Daniel himself, the smooth rehearsed voice gone tight, asking to speak to his mother. Daniel came on the 23rd of December, a year almost to the day from the night he had driven her to the spare room. He came because he had no choice left. Coastal Ridge had sued. Their lawyers had pulled the title, found the Hartley Family Trust, found Eleanor's name as sole trustee since 1986, and found beneath the void sale a second forged signature, matching the first. The county prosecutor in Caldwell had opened a file. Daniel's own attorney had told him, plainly, that there was exactly one path that did not end in a courtroom and a record. His mother could, if she chose, ratify nothing and instead sign a settlement that returned the developer's money and declined to press the forgery, or she could let it all proceed. And he would answer for both signatures at once. The leverage he had held over her for a year had inverted completely. Everything now rested on the hand of the woman he had called confused. He drove out to Birch Hollow Road in his good coat. The drive had been plowed and salted. There were cars along it, more than a dozen, and lights in every window, and wood smoke standing straight up in the cold. He came up onto the porch he remembered from childhood and stopped at the door, because beside it hung a brass plaque he had to read twice. The Brandt Family Respite Home, founded by Eleanor Brandt, for every grandmother who was left on a holiday. Eleanor opened the door before he knocked. Behind her, he could see the long table. Every chair filled old men and old women he did not know. plates steaming, a fire going, somebody's grandchildren under the table with a dog. The smell that came out the open door was cardamom bread. She had been baking it all day, the slow way, by hand. He started the way he always started. "Mom, before you get upset, I'm not upset, Daniel." She said it without heat, and that was worse than heat, and he heard it. He had brought a folder. He set it on the porch rail and opened it and began to explain the lawsuit, the money, the prosecutor, what he needed her to sign, how it had all gotten out of hand, how none of it had to happen if she would just help him the way a mother helps her son. His voice climbed as he went. She let him finish. She had learned how to let a man finish. When he was done, she did not reach for the folder. "I know what's in the suitcase, Daniel," she said. "I knew before you sold the lake house. I knew before you froze yourself out of it." She told him the rest in the flat, even voice of a woman reading a ledger. The 142 shares in the name he never thought to check. The trust your father made in 1986 with my name on it. The $3 million that was in this house and this family. The whole time you were calling it worthless and waving your hand at it. "You had a power of attorney and a forged deed," she said. "Your father had a wife he trusted." He wondered. Daniel's mouth opened, and nothing came. The folder sat on the rail between them. Out at the road, his future was a prosecutor's file and a developer's lawsuit and a number he did not have. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her grandson's age was the only thing she let herself feel the boy she had raised alone. Somewhere far down inside the man on her porch, "I'm going to sign your settlement," she said. "The developer gets their money back. There won't be charges." She watched the relief break over his face, and she stopped it with one sentence. "Not because of you. Because I will not have this house's first Christmas be the one where I sent my son to prison. That's for them," she nodded back at the table, the full chairs, the strangers warm at last, "not for you." Then she did the things she had planned since the bus. She stepped back from the door and held it open, and the warmth and the cardamom and the sound of 20 people came out into the cold around him. "You can come in," she said. By the following December, the Brandt family respite home took 14 guests over the holidays, and there was a waiting list. Eleanor still rose at 5:40 without an alarm. She put the big kettle on now instead of the small one, and while the house slept, she sat at the long farmhouse table with the green cloth notebook in the day's accounts, every dollar entered in her small, even hand. Balanced to the penny by the time the first guest came down. On Sundays, she did the Caldwell Papers crossword in ink. Ruth Okafor came on Tuesdays, and they ran the week's numbers together. Though Eleanor never once needed the help, the 12 beds were always made. There was a man named Arthur who had been left at a bus station by his daughter and now fixed every squeaking hinge in the house before anyone asked. There was a woman named Pearl who could not remember her own children's names, but remembered all the words to the carols and led them after supper while the fire went down. The porch board did not sag anymore. The door no longer stuck. Walter's pine floors had been sanded and oiled until they glowed. On Tuesday afternoons, Eleanor baked cardamom bread the slow way, by hand, and she taught it to whoever wanted to learn, an old man with shaking hands, a volunteer's teenage daughter, a widow who had not cooked for anyone in a decade. She told them what she had told Lily once at a kitchen table on Sycamore Lane. "Anything worth keeping," she said, folding the dough over slow, "you make with your hands that Daniel sent a card that second Christmas." Eleanor read it once and set it on the mantel with the others, neither closer to the center nor farther from it than any of them. He had sat in the guest chair that first year for one supper. He had not come back. The chair was there for him if he ever did. the same as it was there for anyone no nearer the head of the table, no farther. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. The brown leather suitcase sat open on a shelf in the front hall now, where the winter coats used to hang at the old house. Inside it, she kept the photograph of Walter on the porch swing, squinting into the sun, and his mother's recipe card, and the pencil note in his blunt hand. The check and the statements were gone filed, cashed, spent on beds and bread, and a long table